So, today I want to talk about a co op internet service provider that's forming in New York City. The story of this ISP starts with Spectrum entering into New York City in 2016. When Spectrum Charter bought out Time Warner Cable, it actually refused to negotiate in any sort of good faith with Time Warner Cable's union workers. These workers decided to go on strike and have continued to do so for 4 years. They have done this without the support of the media, without the support of the people of New York City, and without any support from the city itself. Now, to have a strike lasting 4 years is actually unheard of. It's actually the longest strike in the history of the United States, and it's even more amazing when we take it into account that this is happening in this day and age, which is largely anti-union. That said, even at the 3 year mark, things were looking a little bleak, and hope was running out, as we found that Spectrum workers had exhausted strike funds, exhausted their savings, and become desperate. Some had crossed picket lines and returned to their old jobs, and estimates among workers varied, but they said that close to half of the original strikers were still out. Those who held the line did whatever they could to survive. Troy Walcott, who did not have any kids to support, decided to drive Uber. Troy Walcott was a shop steward, and he heard all sorts of stories of suffering. You see people losing their homes, losing their cars, losing their jobs, losing their relationships with their wives, breaking down constantly. The longer it stretches out, the harder it gets for people, he said. When I got those calls, it affects me like it was me. The choices were grim. Cross the picket line, pursue part-time hustles in hopes of a resolution, or get a new full-time job. Starting over from square one, even if you've had decades of experience as a Spectrum employee. Now, this is something that someone who's had decades of experience and has worked and devoted themselves to a company should not have to experience. And someone working for over 20 years likely built New York City's infrastructure in terms of its internet service. And for that person to be treated with such disrespect is horrendous. The resolve of these workers, however, has continued to maintain, because 1,200 out of the 1,800 workers that started have held the line. And there is hope. Some of these same workers have done something extraordinary. Because they've been tired of the disrespect from Charter and Spectrum and any sort of company who would treat them in an authoritarian way, they have begun to build their own internet service provider as a co-op, a cooperative internet service provider known as People's Choice. This model, this is how we're going to fight these large corporations and find better alternatives in the future. We're going to subvert them and make it so that the workers and people take over the companies and the industries. And this model and this particular case is really worth paying attention to. So in the interest of learning more about this endeavor, I want to explore their About Us page so we can see their story in their own words, and you can see exactly what they're about. Now, if we go to their website, peopleschoice.coop, and we check out their About Us, it has their story. People's Choice Communication is an employee-owned social enterprise launched by members of IBEW Local Number 3 to bridge the digital divide and help our neighbors get connected to the internet during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are the workers who built a large part of New York City's internet infrastructure in the first place. We built out Spectrum's cable system until in 2017, the company pushed us out on strike by taking away our healthcare, retirement, and other benefits. It's now the longest strike in U.S. history. Now, some things to note in just the start of this About Us. They built this not just for themselves, but for the city, for the people in the city. Because Spectrum was not providing enough internet for people in New York City during the pandemic. With their exorbitant prices and everything else, some people couldn't afford it, especially in areas of low income. And so they decided to take it upon themselves to solve multiple problems, not just their own. That was the city's problem, it was the people's problem, and it was their own problem. Because again, these are the people who had their labor stolen. These are the people who were building all of the infrastructure for this and were getting paid a small sum of what they put into their labor. By taking over and making their own cooperative ISP, they now control everything. And they're sharing it with the people, as we'll come to see. It's not a bunch of executives in a boardroom making the money. It is workers making it. And as we go on, at a certain point, we realized that we weren't the only ones who had a problem with Spectrum. Most New Yorkers are unhappy with the high prices and low quality service of their internet service provider. And those people are the people who have service. According to the Comptroller's office, over 2.2 million New Yorkers don't have high-speed broadband at home because they can't afford it. This digital divide was a problem before the pandemic. During COVID-19, lack of internet access became a matter of survival. We decided to see what we could do to help. In summer of 2020, we launched People's Choice Communications. We're an ISP, but we're a little different than other ISPs. People's Choice is worker-owned. The Spectrum strikers own the company, and we run it democratically. And that's so important, to have the workers in a horizontal fashion democratically run their country, and not be based on the vertical monopolistic tendencies of most ISPs is something that is brilliant and needs to continue to happen. We need to make more like this. This is the future. Our networks are community owned, and we build out a network in your building. It transfers to cooperative ownership. So when they build the infrastructure, you become a partial owner. You partially own it, so it belongs to the people as well. Profits are returned to users. We're able to provide high-speed service, in most cases, for up to $10 to $20 a month. No more cable company ripping you off, and as an owner, you have a vote in policies like data privacy. So not only do you get to get some money back, not only do you get to get this internet service for extremely cheap rates and none of the gimmicky pricings that you see in a normal ISP, but then you get to have a vote and say as to how the internet service provider and the data analysis and everything else is handled. So within their website, they have a link to connect you to their services and to contact them. They have an Our Works page where they talk about their installations and what they've done, with a reminder that their team built New York City's infrastructure. This is a group of people who knows what they're doing. And they have a form to get online, and they want to turn this into a phone service, which will be able to be provided free for qualifying customers, meaning that you might be able to see cell service given to people who might not have otherwise had it. This is huge. This is important. And if a city like New York City can pull this off, then there's no reason anywhere else couldn't. If people could get this type of infrastructure in a major city, that would be huge. To have these entire networks moving between city to city, and to have a cooperative or some sort of arrangement where they could share services between cities, like cell phone communications, this could really change the scope and landscape of the way we handle things and remove some of the monopolistic powers of these large companies. And to be perfectly honest, this is exactly the kind of thing we need to be doing to make a difference. If you want to go out and get there, go out and try to make a difference and just go out there, this is something to consider. Especially with the pandemic, we've seen the value that internet will have with everything. We use it for employment, for education, for shopping, and so much more. And to take over a utility and make it public in this way, and to be able to provide a space for others outside of the normal practices is important. The more we form worker co-ops, the more we start to replace this tired model of wages. The less we also then have to depend on authoritarian models of business, and the less we have to depend on government for scraps. The less we have to beg for government to change the models and institutions of a wage slave system. And the more we'll be able to dictate our own policies within our communities. This is huge and this is important. We can really start to create a better reality for ourselves and build a better society off of our collective skills, and to rid ourselves of the middle people who take money and don't put anything really into this system. Now, the funny thing about all this that I really need to point out is that I've seen practically no coverage of this outside of Gizmodo. And I need to give a shout out to Gizmodo for actually covering this. This should be a huge major news story where people are rallying behind this, because this is going to provide internet service for such a cheap price to so many people. If we could use this model and move it outward towards multiple cities and multiple places, again, this could really change the landscape of how we see internet service provided. But somehow, we're not seeing that in major news outlets. And on some level, I'm really not surprised. That said, Gizmodo has provided some more details that I think are relevant, so I'd really like to take a look at their article. So they put out an article called Revenge, Spectrum Workers on Strike Build Their Own ISP. So within the city that is constantly fighting Spectrum, it's worth noting that with Spectrum coming into power, it's not just been workers, but everyone has been really unsatisfied. Andrew Cuomo tried to evict it. Attorney generals had to chase it around for allegedly defrauding 2.2 million New York City customers. And the company was accused of putting employees in harm's way just 1 month into the pandemic. Unionized Spectrum workers hit 4 years of their strike, during which Spectrum's parent company Charter made its CEO the third highest compensated executive in America. So while CEOs are making more and more money, workers who are in a union can't even negotiate a contract. The workers then, of course, we know created this co-op, who co-own the company. The building residents own the network. The C-suite doesn't extract a single cent. Nothing is being extracted in between. You own the infrastructure in your building. You own the network. You choose your ISP, which will presumably be this particular company, who will come in and maintain it. You buy off the labor and the installation of the infrastructure and the tower by paying about $300 to $400 per apartment in a general apartment building, which will be paid off as a sort of mortgage or lease in monthly payments that are $10 to $20 a month, which will also cover service fees. So basically, what they're doing, they come into your building agrees to let them build a tower. That tower is then owned by the building and can be used by the building as a network hub. They then pay $10 to $20 a month until they reach the full fee of $300 to $400 per apartment. And then you own it. Your building owns everything. And you would continue to pay a fee that would provide you the internet service because you have to pay for the data stream. But that's all you're paying for. You're not paying for infrastructure. You're not paying for the company to lease you every single month in your building all of the infrastructure. The city doesn't have to pay for it either. And so it cuts taxes, it cuts costs all across, and all you're doing is plugging in your router like you would in any other case. And that's important also because it needs to be noted that it won't change on the customer end. You'll just be paying cheaper rates and you'll own it. And this is the difference between renting and leasing something and owning it. And it becomes so much cheaper. And when we compare that $10 to $20 a month price to the cheapest prices in Spectrum being in the range of $50, with packages going up to $150, which, mind you, represents a quarter of the price that a person in public housing would pay for rent, that's ridiculous. That is an obvious switch. It's cheaper and it's better for people. Why not go with this model? So the People's Choice Cooperative uses a light, scalable infrastructure. This fixed wireless network is enabled by what's known as a mesh network. Antennas are installed on the top of buildings, which receive a wireless signal from the co-op central hub. The building's residents then again use it as normal. In the event of a link break, so if any building or tower breaks down and the wind knocks the thing down, or a storm hits it, or any number of other possibilities that might cause damage to a part of the network node, a link in that node, the different infrastructures will reroute themselves and will create a situation where large-scale outages might stop. Basically, if one antenna breaks down, they can reroute around it to bring service back to that building and to bring the local area back up. Meaning that, if you have what would normally knock down a large sector of a city like New York, you might only lose like a building or two, or a small block, because the buildings would be able to reroute it. And the more buildings that have this, the better it will run, and the more it will be able to maintain itself. Now, the co-op makes a radical proposition in the business structure itself By parsing out the network to customers and the ISP company to workers implies that both get a say in the collective bargaining. Company and people who pay the company now have a voice. Whereas the monopolistic practices that we look at now, people don't really have a choice. They don't have any say in how their ISP is run. So customers who own their own infrastructure could theoretically choose a new internet service provider if customer service is not kept up. It means that the company has to keep providing you better customer service and treating customers well. Because if you could theoretically take the infrastructure that you have and was built for you and say, I want to go with a different co-op or I want to go with a different company, you're able to do so. Why? Because you own the infrastructure. So you can just switch to someone else if they don't provide service and don't provide repairs and they throttle your internet. You could just switch to another co-op. You could switch to another company and you own the property. You own the network. So they can't hold you hostage with that. And that's great. Because again, that means they have to provide you better customer service. They have to be working with you. There has to be constant communication between buildings and people. And I think it's also worth noting that companies like Comcast pocket 97% of their profit margins, where in this case, people are getting the money. Workers are getting paid. They are getting, a portion of what the company, People's Choice, is making. They own it, and the people are happier, the workers are happier, and there's no middle people, no corporate executives, nothing. This is a model for the future as far as I'm concerned. We need to start switching towards this. And from the words of the company itself, we have a big portion of most of the Bronx covered with our antennas, Walcott had said. Now we have to go building by building to let people know that we're out there and starting to turn them on. A few dozen Spectrum strikers have been actively involved in these installations, but Walcott expects that at least 100 workers are waiting in the wings for the project to scale up. And as they scale up more and more, they'll be able to take in more of the former employees, or future former employees of Spectrum that are on strike, which means they're able to subvert Spectrum and to create this company of workers, by workers, for workers. So currently they are only able to get about 25 megabits per second internet, which is not the fastest. But again, as they keep building more and more parts of the network, that mesh grid network will expand. One person from the company, Eric Foreman, said, up until this past year, the idea of creating mesh networks like this, or fixed wireless networks, was basically something that only anarchist nerds did. Speaking as an anarchist nerd myself, Foreman had said that a research center that envisions worker-owned cooperatives like this is where he works. So, here's something I need to point out. If you're coming into this video and you don't have a perspective of leftist belief or anarchist belief like I subscribe to, and that my channel's typically about, I'm telling you this right now. This is the essence of anarchism. It is building these types of communities and infrastructure and changing the way we do things to try to give workers a say over businesses and over corporate executives. It is a shift in power and a shift in dynamics. You might have a lot of perspectives and beliefs about anarchists, but this is the true core of what anarchy is. It's trying to create a better world where we all cooperatively own things. And I hope that this changes some perspectives on what anarchy is about. And as a leftist, this is what I think we need to be really focusing on. Now, a research center that envisions worker-owned alternatives, this cooperative digital economy, is where Eric Foreman works. And one example of their efforts is to try to create a worker-owned alternative to Uber. And this is something else that's just fascinating and interesting. The idea that we could switch the model of how we do these apps to one that's cooperative owned. Do we have to have a system in which one person or one organization owns a single app and, networks people out? The whole thing lends itself to an anarchist model, where on some level we are doing the work ourselves for our neighbors, so why shouldn't we be able to subvert the companies and the CEOs in that particular way either? If somebody in your neighborhood needs a drive, if there's a person who needs that, if your neighbor needed that, you would just go out and give them a drive. So I think this is a good model to start leaning towards a direction where we start to take care of ourselves without a middle person stealing our wealth. And because we're helping our neighbors anyway, that's what we should be doing. Now, the city of New York has to decide whether or not the Spectrum strikers should be able to, with this company, be given funding for what they're doing. And honestly, I think New York City is foolish if they don't. The way Spectrum has treated everything, and I think with the upcoming New York City mayoral race, this should be a point of contention. Any mayoral candidate who does not support these workers and try to go into that should not be the mayor of New York City, as far as I'm concerned. New York City is actually soliciting proposals for some sort of affordable wireless network solutions to help with their affordable housing programs. So this could actually be the start of them helping build infrastructure and providing some sort of funding to create these networks. And if they get that kind of boost, this could become citywide a lot quicker than we think. So at the moment, People's Choice prioritizes the Bronx. And the main reason that they do that is because the Bronx had a dearth of Spectrum service. As of November 2020, the New York City Comptroller's Office estimated that 100,000 students were entirely without internet service. Just a few months into the outbreak of the pandemic, the company petitioned the FCC to impose data caps, artificial limits on the internet usage in order to charge more. Thousands of people have published Better Business Bureau complaints in the New York metropolitan area, reporting service outages, surprise bills for unused services, and massive pay hikes. And again, they have no interest in providing service to the Bronx when they can get huge gains in a place like the Upper East Side, because they'll pay for the higher end packages. And that's not what we need to be about when we're talking about utilities. This is an issue that happens in rural areas as well, where electrical grids and where internet service providers don't want to pay for the infrastructure to go out to those areas because it costs too much, because it cuts out their profit. And instead, we need to have services that are providing for people, because what's the point of a utility except to provide for people? What's the point of any of this if we're not giving the best to people? And there was a belief at one time, quite erroneously, that capitalism provided this best model. But we're seeing that these types of cooperatives are providing a much better model where workers own the means of production. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara. I really hope you check out People's Choice and try to look at its model, and I really hope you enjoyed watching. Have a great day.